A man in 18th century Oxford sat alone with a stack of ancient Hebrew poetry and noticed something that no one in over 1,000 years of biblical scholarship had ever fully articulated. The lines were not random, they came in pairs. And the second line of almost every pair was doing something deliberate to the first, echoing it, intensifying it, reversing it, completing it, in a pattern so consistent, so structurally rigorous, that it could only be the product of a literary tradition with its own internal grammar. Not just religious feeling poured onto a page, architecture, a formal system built into the very bones of biblical poetry that had been hiding in plain sight in plain English. Translations for centuries, because English translations had been quietly erasing it. His name was Robert Lowth. He was a professor of poetry and later a bishop, and in 1753 he delivered a series of lectures that would permanently change how the entire Western world reads its own most sacred text. What he had found was not a hidden code, not a secret protocol, not a message planted by anything supernatural. It was something more interesting than that, because it was real, provable, and still being expanded upon by serious scholars today. The actual literary architecture underlying biblical prayer, poetry, lament, and praise. A structure so deliberate that once you learn to see it, you cannot unsee it in a single psalm ever again. This is the real story of what scholars have found when they studied the structure of biblical prayer with the tools of literary analysis. Not fabricated drama, not an AI hallucination dressed up as revelation. Centuries of genuine, peer-reviewed, painstakingly assembled scholarship that reveals something the original authors knew and modern readers mostly don't. That the prayers of the Bible were built, not just felt. Engineered with formal precision across nearly 1,500 years by dozens of different authors, writing in different centuries under wildly different circumstances, all working, consciously or through deep cultural inheritance, within the same underlying literary system. To understand what Lowth discovered, you first need to understand what was hiding from him, and from every reader before him, inside the translation itself. When the Hebrew Bible is rendered into English, what gets carried across most successfully is meaning, the content of what is being said. What gets lost, almost completely, in standard prose translation is the architecture of how it is being said. Hebrew poetry does not rhyme the way English poetry typically does. It does not follow a regular meter in the way Greek or Latin verse does, counting syllables or stresses in predictable patterns. For centuries, this absence of rhyme and meter led many readers to assume that Hebrew poetic texts, the Psalms chief among them, were simply elevated prose. Beautiful, perhaps. Emotionally resonant, certainly, but not formally poetry in any technical sense because the tools Western readers used to identify poetry simply weren't present. Lowth's insight was that Hebrew poetry had its own formal system entirely, one that worked through meaning rather than sound. He called it parallelism, and once he had named it and systematically documented it across the biblical text, an entire hidden architecture became visible. The basic unit of Hebrew poetry, as Lowth identified it, is not a single line standing alone. It is a pairing, typically 2 lines, called a bicolon, sometimes 3, called a tricolon, in which the second line does not simply repeat the first. It does something to it. It develops it, intensifies it, mirrors it, or deliberately contradicts it, and the relationship between the 2 lines is where the actual meaning of the passage lives. Consider how this works in practice, because once you see the mechanism, you start noticing it everywhere in the biblical text. The most basic form Lowth identified is what scholars now call synonymous parallelism, where the second line essentially restates the first using different words, reinforcing the same idea from a slightly different angle. Not redundancy, but a kind of structural reinforcement, the same truth stated twice in different language, so that neither statement alone has to carry the full weight. Then there is antithetical parallelism, where the second line does the opposite of the first, building meaning through contrast rather than repetition, a righteous path set directly against a wicked one, blessing set against curse. The way the entire first psalm in the Hebrew Bible is constructed around exactly this kind of structural opposition between the righteous and the wicked, their fates laid out in deliberately mirrored contrasting lines. And there is synthetic parallelism, sometimes called developmental, where the second line does not simply mirror or oppose the first, but builds forward from it, adding a new idea that depends on the first line to make sense, advancing the thought rather than restating it. These are not modern scholarly impositions onto an ancient text that never intended them. Hebrew scholar James Kugel, whose work on the subject remains foundational, identified parallelism as the basic structural feature underlying not just the songs of the Bible, but most of its proverbs, laws, laments, blessings, curses, prayers, and formal speeches as well. The examples are not rare or occasional. They number in the thousands across the poetic portions of the Hebrew Bible alone, with more than 1,000 identifiable instances in the book of Isaiah by itself. Entire chapters of books like Proverbs and large sections of Isaiah are constructed almost exclusively from these paired, structurally related lines. verse after verse, each one a small engineered unit of meaning built from exactly the kind of architecture Lowth first systematically documented. But parallelism, while foundational, is only the beginning of what later scholarship revealed about the formal structure of biblical prayer specifically. Because prayer, as a category of biblical literature, turns out to have its own deeper architecture beyond the line-by-line poetic structure, a structure operating at the level of the entire prayer, not just its individual verses. The scholar most responsible for uncovering this larger architecture was a German Old Testament researcher named Hermann Gunkel, working in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, who approached the Book of Psalms with a method that was, for its time, genuinely innovative. Rather than treating each psalm as a unique, isolated literary creation to be interpreted entirely. On its own terms, Gunkel asked a different question. Were there recurring types, recognizable categories of psalm that shared structural features across many different texts written by many different authors? His method, which came to be called form criticism, involved systematically comparing psalms against each other to identify shared patterns of structure and content, and then comparing those patterns against similar religious texts from other cultures of the ancient Near East to understand where this literary tradition came from and how it functioned. What Gunkel found was that biblical prayer was not an undifferentiated outpouring of religious emotion. It sorted, with striking consistency, into distinct formal categories, each with its own internal architecture, a kind of genre system for addressing God that biblical authors across centuries appear to have understood and worked within, whether consciously following established conventions or absorbing them so deeply through cultural and liturgical practice that the structure became second nature. The category that has received perhaps the most sustained scholarly attention, because it appears so frequently throughout the Psalter, and because its structure is so consistently identifiable, is what Gunkel termed the individual lament. This is prayer offered by a single worshiper in a moment of personal crisis, illness, persecution, betrayal, grief, mortal danger. And scholars studying these psalms across the Hebrew Bible have identified a consistent structural sequence that recurs across dozens of separate compositions, written by different authors, across different centuries, addressing wildly different specific crises. The pattern typically begins with an invocation, directly addressing God by name, establishing the relationship before anything else is said. It moves into the complaint, the honest, often unflinchingly raw description of the crisis itself, and biblical lament is notable among ancient religious literature for how little it softens this complaint, how directly it can express anger, confusion, even accusation toward God, without the prayer being considered impious or invalid for doing so. The complaint is followed by a direct request for help or deliverance, specific and concrete rather than vague. And then, in a structural turn that scholars have found remarkably consistent across these prayers, the lament moves into an expression of confidence or certainty that God has heard the prayer and will respond. A shift in tone, often abrupt, from desperation to assurance, occurring before the crisis itself has actually been resolved within the text. Many of these laments conclude with a vow, a promise to offer thanksgiving once deliverance has come. This is not a structure imposed from outside onto texts that happen to resemble each other by coincidence. It is a recognizable, repeatable literary form deployed by authors across the span of Israel's national life, from the period of the monarchy through the fall of Jerusalem and into the Second Temple, period that followed, adapted to circumstances ranging from the private anguish of an individual worshiper to communal prayers offered on behalf of the entire nation in moments of national catastrophe. The consistency of the underlying architecture, even as the specific content varies enormously from psalm to psalm, is precisely what allowed Gunkel and the scholars who followed him to identify it as a genuine formal category rather than coincidental similarity. There are other recurring categories scholars have identified using the same comparative method. Royal psalms, grouped not primarily by literary structure, but by their consistent connection to specific moments in the life of Israel's pre-exilic kings. Coronation, marriage, departure for military campaign, reflecting the unique theological role the monarch was understood to occupy in relation to God within ancient Israelite religious thought. Hymns of communal praise, structurally distinct from individual lament, typically built around direct calls to worship followed by the specific reasons God deserves that worship, often drawing on the language of creation or the historical acts of deliverance in Israel's national story. Thanksgiving psalms, which function almost as the formal completion of the lament structure. A prayer offered specifically because an earlier crisis, described in lament-like terms, has now been resolved, closing the structural loop that the lament's concluding vow had promised. Beyond these larger formal categories, scholars studying the poetic architecture of individual psalms in even finer detail have identified structural techniques operating at a more intricate level still. Chiasm, or chiastic parallelism, is a pattern in which the structural elements of a passage are arranged so that they mirror each other in reverse order. If you were to map the parallel elements visually, connecting matching ideas with lines, the resulting diagram forms an X shape, which is where the term comes from, drawing on the Greek letter chi. This is not a simple back-and-forth pairing, but a more sophisticated architectural arrangement, where an idea introduced early in a passage is deliberately echoed by a corresponding idea near the end, with the structure building toward and then mirroring back from a central pivot point. Scholars have identified chiastic structures operating not just within individual verses, but across entire psalms and even larger units of biblical narrative, suggesting that ancient authors were thinking about literary architecture at a scale far beyond the individual line. Even more structurally rigorous still are the biblical acrostics, poems deliberately constructed, so that each successive verse, or in some cases each successive line within a verse, begins with the next consecutive letter of the 22-letter Hebrew alphabet, moving systematically from Aleph through Tav. Psalm 119, the longest chapter in the entire Bible, is built on an enormously elaborate version of this technique, divided into 22 stanzas, one for each letter of the Hebrew alphabet, with every single line within each 8-line stanza beginning with that stanza's designated letter. The Book of Lamentations contains 5 separate poems mourning the destruction of Jerusalem, and the first 4 of these 5 poems are likewise constructed as acrostics, each working systematically through the Hebrew alphabet. This is not loose, ecstatic religious expression. This is an extraordinarily demanding formal constraint, deliberately chosen and skillfully executed, the biblical equivalent of a poet committing to write an entire extended composition in a strict, predetermined formal pattern, line after line, letter after letter, without breaking the constraint once across dozens of verses. What scholars have increasingly come to understand, as this body of research has deepened across more than 2.5 centuries since Louth's original lectures, is that these formal structures were not merely decorative. They served interpretive and theological functions that are inseparable from the content of the prayers themselves. Antithetical parallelism, with its built-in structure of contrast, is uniquely suited to wisdom literature concerned with drawing sharp moral distinctions between righteous and wicked paths, precisely because the form itself enacts the distinction it describes. The individual laments consistent structural movement from raw complaint toward expressed confidence reflects and reinforces a specific theological understanding of how prayer functions in a covenant relationship with God, an understanding that crisis can be voiced honestly and completely without restraint, while still being held within an overarching framework of trust that the relationship itself will hold. The acrostic form, demanding complete coverage of the alphabet from beginning to end, has been read by scholars as embodying a kind of totality or completeness in its subject matter. A psalm about God's law that exhaustively works through the entire alphabet may be formally enacting the comprehensiveness of the law it describes. A set of laments over Jerusalem's destruction that does the same may be enacting the totality and completeness of the grief being expressed. Beyond Israel's own borders, Gunkel and the scholars who followed his comparative method situated these biblical literary patterns within the much broader context of religious poetry across the ancient Near East. Parallel structures, recurring formal categories of address to deity, even acrostic techniques are not unique to the Hebrew Bible, but appear, with variations, across other literary traditions of the ancient Mesopotamian and broader Near Eastern world. This comparative context does not diminish what is distinctive about biblical prayer. If anything, it sharpens the picture, allowing scholars to identify precisely which formal techniques biblical authors shared with the broader literary culture surrounding them, and which theological and structural choices were genuinely their own. The specific way the individual laments structural pivot toward confidence reflects a theology of covenant relationship distinct from comparable prayer traditions in neighboring cultures. For instance, even where the underlying literary techniques of parallelism and formal structure were broadly shared across the region. What emerges from 2.5 centuries of this kind of careful, comparative, formally rigorous literary scholarship is a portrait of biblical prayer that is, in its own way, just as remarkable as any of the more sensational claims that circulate about it online, and considerably more defensible because every element of it can be checked against the actual Hebrew text, verified by independent scholars and traced through a documented history of academic publication, stretching back to Louth's original 1753 lectures, and continuing through Gunkel's form-critical method, and into the detailed structural and comparative work scholars continue to publish today. The prayers of the Bible were not produced as spontaneous, formless outpourings of religious feeling, written without regard to literary craft. They were composed within a sophisticated, internally consistent system of formal techniques. Parallelism operating at the level of individual lines, recurring structural patterns operating at the level of entire compositions, and demanding constraints like acrostic form operating across extended works, a literary architecture that dozens of different authors across roughly 15 centuries of composition, working in radically different historical circumstances, all drew upon, inherited, and in many cases pushed to remarkable creative extremes. This is what genuine peer-reviewed scholarship into the structure of biblical prayer actually reveals. Not a hidden code planted by something beyond human authorship, but the visible fingerprints of human literary skill operating within and developing a shared formal tradition across an extraordinary span of historical time. Authors who never met each other, writing in a language whose poetic conventions had been passed down and refined across generations, working within structures sophisticated enough that scholars are still discovering new dimensions of their architecture more than 250 years after Robert Loth first sat down with that stack of Hebrew poetry and noticed the lines were not random. They were built. And what scholars have spent 2.5 centuries doing patiently and rigorously is learning to read the blueprint.